But now, with the security of a loving family and the confidence that came from genuine achievement, Harry was free to pursue whatever path genuinely interested and fulfilled him. His relationships with his peers had also deepened and matured as he became more confident in his own worth and more skilled at authentic communication. Ron and Hermione remained his closest friends, but his social circle had expanded to include other students who appreciated him for his genuine qualities rather than his famous name. "You know what I like about you, Harry," Susan Bones had said during a recent study session in the library. "You actually listen when people talk to you. Most people our age are just waiting for their turn to speak, but you really care about what others think and feel." It was a skill Harry had developed partly through his therapeutic work and partly through his mentorship of younger children, but mostly through the simple experience of being valued and heard by the adults in his life. He had learned that relationships were stronger when they were based on mutual respect and genuine interest rather than fear or obligation. His magical abilities had also grown stronger and more controlled since the removal of the Horcrux. Without the interference of Voldemort's soul fragment, Harry's natural magical signature had stabilized and strengthened in ways that amazed his professors. "Your wand work has become remarkably precise," Professor McGonagall observed during one of their private transfiguration sessions, "and your intuitive understanding of magical theory has grown exponentially. I think the Horcrux was suppressing more of your natural abilities than we initially realized." Harry found that magic came more easily to him now, flowing naturally from intention rather than requiring the intense concentration it had demanded before. More importantly, he enjoyed the learning process in a way he never had when his survival depended on academic performance. Magic was beautiful and fascinating, and having the freedom to explore it without pressure or fear made all the difference in his development as a wizard. His therapeutic work with healer Vance had also continued to yield meaningful progress. The weekly sessions had become a cornerstone of his recovery, providing him with tools for processing difficult emotions and building resilience against future challenges. "You've developed remarkable emotional intelligence," she had observed during a recent session. "Your ability to recognize and articulate your feelings, to set appropriate boundaries, to ask for help when you need it. These are skills that many adults never master." "It helps to have adults in my life who actually want me to develop those skills," Harry had replied. "At the Dursleys, having feelings or needs was seen as problematic. Here, everyone expects me to grow and change and become more capable." "How does that feel?" Healer Vance had asked. "Amazing," Harry had said without hesitation. "Like I'm finally becoming the person I was meant to be, instead of just trying to survive whatever situation I'm stuck in." The work with abuse survivors had also become more sophisticated as Harry gained experience and training. The Department of Magical Child Welfare had provided him with formal education in trauma-informed care and child advocacy, and he had become skilled at helping newly rescued children navigate the complex emotions of recovery. "The thing that helped me the most," he told a group of children during one of his regular mentorship sessions, "was learning that healing isn't linear. Some days you'll feel strong and confident, and other days you'll feel scared or sad or angry about what happened to you. All of those feelings are normal and valid." A 12-year-old wizard named Marcus raised his hand. "But how do you know if you're getting better if some days are still bad?" Harry smiled at the boy with genuine understanding. "That's a really good question. For me, getting better wasn't about never having bad days. It was about having more good days than bad ones, and learning that the bad days don't last forever. And most importantly, it was about having adults in my life who cared about helping me feel better instead of adults who caused the bad feelings in the first place." These conversations with other survivors remained among the most meaningful aspects of Harry's recovery, helping children understand that they deserved better treatment, that the abuse hadn't been their fault, that healing was possible. This work gave profound purpose to his own experiences and demonstrated that even the most painful parts of life could be transformed into sources of strength and compassion. His relationship with McGonagall had also continued to deepen and mature as they both adjusted to their new family dynamic. The formal adoption had provided legal security, but the emotional bond between them had grown naturally from shared experiences and mutual affection. "You know," McGonagall said one evening as they sat together reading in their sitting room, "I used to worry that I didn't know enough about parenting to be a good guardian for you. I'd spent my career teaching other people's children, but I'd never been responsible for someone's complete well-being the way I am for yours." Harry looked up from his book on magical jurisprudence. "What changed your mind?" "I realized that the most important thing wasn't having all the answers," she replied thoughtfully. "It was being willing to learn and adapt, to prioritize your needs over my convenience, to love you unconditionally, regardless of what challenges we might face." "You've been perfect," Harry said simply. "Not because you never make mistakes, but because you always care more about my well-being than about being right or maintaining control. That's what I never had before, an adult who valued my happiness and growth above everything else." As his second year at Hogwarts progressed and his 13th birthday approached, Harry found himself reflecting often on how completely his life had been transformed. The frightened, isolated child who had arrived at the castle believing he deserved whatever treatment he received had grown into a confident young person with a clear sense of his own worth and a meaningful purpose in life. His academic achievements had earned him respect from professors and peers alike. His advocacy work had given him a sense of purpose that went far beyond personal success. His relationships were based on mutual affection and respect rather than fear or obligation. Most importantly, he was surrounded by people who loved him unconditionally and supported his continued growth and development. "I have something for you," McGonagall said one morning, producing a letter with the official seal of the London Institute of Magical Jurisprudence. "This arrived yesterday." Harry opened the letter with hands that trembled slightly with anticipation. The Institute was his first choice for post-Hogwarts education, and while his grades certainly qualified him for admission, he had learned not to take positive outcomes for granted. "Dear Mr. Potter McGonagall," he read aloud, his voice growing stronger with each word, "we are pleased to inform you that you have been accepted into the London Institute of Magical Jurisprudence's early admission program, conditional upon completion of your Hogwarts education with continued academic excellence." The letter went on to detail scholarship opportunities, advanced placement options, and the Institute's particular interest in his work with child advocacy and institutional reform. But what struck Harry most powerfully was the name on the letter, Potter McGonagall. His chosen identity, reflecting both his heritage and his chosen family, officially recognized by the institution he hoped to attend. "I'm so proud of you," McGonagall said, and her voice was thick with emotion. "Not just for this acceptance, but for everything you've accomplished and become over the past year." Harry set the letter aside and looked around their comfortable sitting room, thinking about the journey that had brought him to this moment. A year ago, he had been a traumatized child with no sense of his own worth and no hope for a better future. Now he was a thriving young person, with clear goals, meaningful work, and the unshakable foundation of a loving family. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for choosing me, for fighting for me, for showing me what it means to be truly safe and loved." "Thank you," McGonagall replied, "for teaching me that the greatest magic of all is watching someone discover their own strength and worth. You've given my life meaning and purpose I never knew I was missing." As spring turned toward summer, and Harry's second year at Hogwarts drew to a close, he found himself looking forward to the future with genuine excitement and confidence. He would continue his advocacy work with the ministry, deepen his therapeutic relationships and recovery work, and prepare for the advanced magical education that would help him achieve his goals of institutional reform and child protection. But more than any specific achievement or goal, Harry was simply grateful to be living a life that was entirely his own, shaped by his choices, supported by people who loved him, and dedicated to purposes that gave meaning to even his most painful experiences. The boy who lived had discovered something more valuable than any prophecy or destiny. He had learned what it meant to truly live, to build a life worth living, and to use his experiences to help others do the same. It was a different future than anyone had planned for him, and it was absolutely perfect. Chapter 12. Resolution and Hope. The morning of Harry's graduation from Hogwarts dawned clear and bright, with the kind of perfect spring weather that seemed designed to celebrate new beginnings and achieved dreams. Harry stood before the mirror in his room, adjusting his graduation robes with hands that were steady, despite the magnitude of the day ahead. The deep blue fabric bore the silver trim that designated him as graduating with highest honors, but more meaningful to Harry was the small pin on his lapel, a simple design that marked him as a certified child advocate, representing 3 years of training and service alongside his regular academic studies. "Are you ready?" McGonagall asked, appearing in his doorway with the kind of radiant pride that had become one of the defining constants of his life. She wore formal robes in Hogwarts green, her hair arranged with particular care for the ceremony, but it was her expression that made Harry's chest tighten with emotion. She was looking at him, the way he had always imagined parents looked at their children on important occasions, with love so deep and pride so profound that it seemed to illuminate everything around them. "I think so," Harry replied, turning from the mirror to face the woman who had quite literally saved his life. "It's strange, isn't it? 7 years ago, I didn't even know magic existed. Now I'm graduating with plans to change the entire system of magical child protection." "Not so strange," McGonagall said, moving into the room to straighten his already perfect robes with the kind of maternal attention that still amazed him after all these years. "You were always destined to be a force for positive change, Harry. The only difference is that now you get to choose what that change looks like." The graduation ceremony itself was held on the grounds of Hogwarts, with families and friends gathered on the great lawn, under a sky that seemed impossibly blue. Harry found his place among his classmates, alphabetically positioned between Michael Potter Brown, a Hufflepuff who had overcome his own difficult family situation with the help of the new Child Protection Services, and Sarah Potter Williams, a Ravenclaw whose adoptive family had been formed through the reformed magical family court system that Harry had helped design. It wasn't a coincidence that there were multiple Potter-named students in his graduating class. The hyphenated surnames had become a symbol throughout magical Britain of children who had been rescued from abusive situations and placed in loving homes through the new systems of care and protection. Harry's own journey from victim to survivor to advocate had inspired a cultural shift in how the magical community approached child welfare, and the evidence of that change was visible throughout the ceremony. As Chief Warlock Bagnold began calling names for the presentation of diplomas, Harry's thoughts drifted to the remarkable journey that had brought him to this moment. 7 years had passed since that first day in the hospital wing, when Madame Pomfrey's scans had revealed the extent of his abuse. 7 years of healing, growth, advocacy, and the slow but steady work of building a life that was entirely his own. "Harry James Potter McGonagall," Bagnold called, and the applause that followed was warm and sustained. Harry walked across the platform with confidence earned through years of hard work and meaningful achievement, accepted his diploma from the woman who had once condemned Dumbledore for his crimes against children, and looked out at the audience to see McGonagall wiping tears from her eyes. But the graduation ceremony was only the beginning of what promised to be a remarkable day. That afternoon, Harry was scheduled to officially launch the Potter Foundation for Magical Child Protection, an organization he had been planning and developing for the past 2 years, with support from the Ministry, private donors, and fellow advocates throughout magical Britain. The Foundation's headquarters were housed in a beautifully restored Victorian mansion in central London, its rooms designed to be welcoming and non-intimidating for the children who would be its primary clients. The The main hall had been transformed for the launch event, filled with supporters, donors, ministry officials, and most importantly, families who had been helped by the new child protection systems that Harry's advocacy had brought into being. "Ladies and gentlemen," Minister Fudge announced to the assembled crowd, "it is my great honor to introduce the founder and director of the Potter Foundation, a young man whose courage in speaking truth to power has transformed how our society protects its most vulnerable members, Harry Potter McGonagall." The applause was sustained and heartfelt, but Harry felt none of the anxiety that public speaking had once caused him. 7 years of advocacy work, testimony before committees, and speeches at conferences had given him the confidence to speak publicly about subjects he was passionate about, and there was no subject closer to his heart than the welfare of magical children. "Thank you," Harry began, his voice carrying clearly through the hall. 7 years ago, I was an 11-year-old boy who had spent his entire life believing that the abuse I suffered was normal, that I deserved whatever treatment I received, and that no adult would ever prioritize my welfare over their own convenience. He paused, looking out at the audience, noting the mix of familiar faces and new ones, children and adults, survivors and advocates, and policymakers who had all played a role in the transformation of magical child protection. Today, I stand before you as a Hogwarts graduate, a certified child advocate, and the director of an organization dedicated to ensuring that no child in magical Britain ever again suffers as I suffered, not just from abuse itself, but from the institutional indifference that allows abuse to continue. The speech he had prepared was carefully crafted, outlining the Foundation's mission, its programs for supporting survivors and their families, its advocacy for continued policy reform, and its commitment to research and education. But as he spoke, Harry found himself departing from his prepared remarks to address something more personal and immediate. "The most important thing I've learned in my journey from victim to survivor to advocate," he said, "is that believing children when they tell you they're being hurt is the first and most crucial step in protecting them. Too often, adults dismiss children's reports of abuse as exaggeration or attention-seeking. Too often, we assume that because a child's abuser appears respectable or holds a position of authority, the child must be mistaken or lying." A murmur of recognition ran through the audience, and Harry could see several people nodding with the understanding of those who had witnessed such dismissals firsthand. "But children don't lie about being hurt," Harry continued with growing conviction. "They might not have the vocabulary to describe their experiences perfectly. They might be confused about what constitutes normal treatment. They might be too frightened to share all the details at once. But when a child tells you they're being hurt, they're telling you the truth as they understand it, and they deserve to be believed, protected, and helped." He went on to describe the Foundation's programs, counseling services for survivors, support groups for families, training programs for educators and social workers, and most importantly, a dedicated hotline where children could report abuse and be certain they would be taken seriously. "Every child who calls our hotline will be believed," Harry declared. "Every report will be investigated thoroughly and promptly. Every child who needs protection will receive it, regardless of who their abuser is or what position they hold in our society. This is not just our mission, it's our solemn promise to the children of magical Britain." The applause that followed was thunderous, but Harry was most moved by the sight of several young people in the audience, teenagers who had been rescued from abusive situations through the new systems his advocacy had helped create. They were standing and applauding, not just for his words, but for the hope and security those words represented. After the formal launch ceremony, Harry spent the afternoon meeting with the Foundation's initial clients and their families, hearing their stories and learning about the challenges that still needed to be addressed. It was emotionally intensive work, but it was also deeply fulfilling in ways that confirmed his conviction that this was the path his life was meant to take. "Mr. Potter McGonagall," said Eleanor Davies, a mother whose 8-year-old daughter had been rescued from an abusive magical boarding school 6 months earlier, "I wanted to thank you personally. If your advocacy hadn't led to the new inspection protocols for magical schools, my daughter might have suffered for years before anyone noticed what was happening to her. Harry knelt down to speak with the little girl, Lucy, who was hiding behind her mother's robes, but watching him with curious eyes. "Hi, Lucy," he said gently. "How are you doing?" "Better," she said quietly. "The bad teachers can't hurt me anymore, because the good teachers found out and stopped them." "That's exactly right," Harry agreed. "And if anyone ever tries to hurt you again, you can tell any grown-up you trust, and they'll believe you and help you. You never have to keep bad secrets about people hurting you." The conversation with Lucy and dozens of other children throughout the day reinforced Harry's understanding of how much progress had been made since his own rescue, but also how much work remained to be done. The systems were better now, infinitely better than they had been when he was suffering in silence at Privet Drive, but they weren't perfect, and there were still children falling through the cracks. As the day wound down and the last guests departed from the Foundation headquarters, Harry found himself standing alone in the main hall, looking at the photographs and artwork that decorated the walls, images of children playing safely, families embracing, and communities coming together to protect their most vulnerable members. "How do you feel?" McGonagall asked, appearing at his elbow with the kind of perfect timing that had characterized their relationship from the beginning. "Proud," Harry said without hesitation. "Proud of what we've accomplished. Proud of the children who have found safety and healing. Proud of the adults who have stepped up to do better than the generation before them." "And how do you feel about yourself?" she pressed gently. Harry considered the question, thinking about the journey that had brought him from the cupboard under the stairs to this moment. Graduation from Hogwarts with highest honors, the successful launch of his own foundation, and a clear sense of purpose that extended far beyond his personal healing. "Grateful," he said finally. "Grateful to have survived long enough to become someone who could help other children survive too. Grateful for every adult who chose to believe me and protect me and help me heal. Grateful for the chance to transform my own suffering into something that could prevent other children from experiencing similar pain." "You know," McGonagall said thoughtfully, "when I first volunteered to be your temporary guardian, I thought I was helping a child who had been failed by our institutions. I had no idea that I was helping raise someone who would fundamentally transform those institutions for the better." Harry smiled at her, noting the tears that were threatening at the corners of her eyes despite her obvious efforts to maintain her composure. "You saw potential in me that I couldn't see in myself. You taught me that I was worth protecting and caring for, and that gave me the foundation to believe that other children were worth protecting too." The weeks that followed the Foundation launch were marked by a steady stream of positive developments that reinforced Harry's growing conviction that lasting change was not only possible but actively occurring throughout magical Britain. The Foundation's hotline received its first calls within days of opening, and every report was handled with the thoroughness and sensitivity that Harry had promised. More significantly, the cultural shift that his advocacy had inspired continued to spread through magical society. Teachers were more vigilant about signs of abuse and neglect. Parents were more aware of the importance of emotional safety as well as physical protection. Children were more confident about reporting mistreatment because they had heard stories of other children being believed and helped. "The statistics are remarkable," reported Delphine Clearwater during one of Harry's monthly meetings with the Department of Magical Child Welfare. "Reports of suspected abuse have increased by 300% since the new systems went into effect. But that's actually excellent news. It means children are finally being heard instead of suffering in silence." "And what about outcomes?" Harry asked, reviewing the detailed reports that tracked not just the number of cases, but their resolution. 97% of reported cases result in improved safety for the children involved, Clearwater replied with obvious satisfaction. Whether that's through family counseling, placement with safer relatives, or removal from dangerous situations, we're actually protecting children instead of just documenting their suffering. The personal satisfaction Harry derived from these professional accomplishments was matched by the continued growth and deepening of his personal relationships. His bond with McGonagall had evolved from guardian-ward to mother-son to something that transcended simple familial categories. They were family in the deepest and most authentic sense, united not just by legal adoption, but by genuine love, shared values, and mutual respect. "I have something for you," she said one evening, as they sat together in their comfortable sitting room, both reading by the warm light of the fireplace. She produced a wrapped package that was clearly a book, but when Harry opened it, he found something far more meaningful than any ordinary text. It was a hand-bound volume containing copies of every letter he had ever written to the children he mentored, every speech he had given about child protection, every policy proposal he had submitted to the ministry, and every piece of advocacy work he had done since beginning his recovery. The title page read simply, "The Words That Changed Everything, a record of one child's journey from victim to advocate. I thought someday you might want to look back and remember how much you've accomplished," McGonagall explained. "And perhaps someday other children might benefit from reading about your journey and understanding that healing and meaningful change are both possible." Harry turned the pages slowly, seeing his own growth and development reflected in the evolution of his writing and thinking. The early letters to abuse survivors were tentative and uncertain, written by someone who was still learning to believe in his own worth. The recent policy proposals were confident and sophisticated, authored by someone who had found his voice and learned to use it effectively. "Thank you," he said quietly. "This means more to me than any official recognition or professional achievement." "You've given my life meaning I never knew was possible," McGonagall replied. "Watching you grow from a frightened, hurt child into the remarkable young man you've become has been the greatest privilege of my life." As Harry's 18th birthday approached, and he prepared to begin his advanced studies at the London Institute of Magical Jurisprudence, he found himself reflecting often on the concept of legacy. 7 years had passed since Madame Pomfrey's courage in reporting her medical findings had set in motion the events that transformed not just his life, but the entire approach to child protection in magical Britain. The changes were visible everywhere he looked. Hogwarts now had a student advocate position, multiple counselors trained in trauma recovery, and protocols for identifying and protecting vulnerable students. The ministry had established the Department of Magical Child Welfare with significant funding and broad authority. Magical family courts had been reformed to prioritize children's voices and well-being. Training programs for teachers, social workers, and law enforcement had been expanded and enhanced. But perhaps most importantly, the cultural conversation around child protection had fundamentally shifted. Children's reports of mistreatment were taken seriously, as a matter of course, rather than dismissed as inconvenient accusations. Adults who worked with children were expected to prioritize child welfare over institutional loyalty or personal convenience. The notion that some greater good could justify allowing children to suffer had been thoroughly rejected by magical society. "Mr. Potter McGonagall," said Minister Fudge during a special ceremony marking the 5th anniversary of the child protection reforms, "your courage in speaking truth about your own experiences and your persistence in advocating for systematic change has quite literally saved hundreds of children from suffering abuse and neglect. The magical community owes you a debt that can never be fully repaid." Harry accepted the Order of Merlin, first class, that was bestowed upon him that day, but he was more moved by the presence in the audience of dozens of children and families who had been helped by the new systems of protection and care. Their safety and well-being were the only recognition he truly needed. On his 18th birthday, Harry stood once again in the hospital wing at Hogwarts, but this time as a visitor rather than a patient. Madame Pomfrey, now in her 70s, but still sharp and efficient, had invited him for tea to mark the anniversary of his rescue and the remarkable journey that had followed. "I often think about that first day," she said, pouring tea with the same careful precision she had always brought to her medical work. when I saw those diagnostic results and realized what you had endured. I was so angry and heartbroken that it took me a moment to remember that my job was to help you heal, not to rage against the adults who had failed you. Your courage in reporting what you found changed everything, Harry replied. If you had followed Dumbledore's instructions to ignore signs of abuse, if you had prioritized institutional loyalty over child welfare, I might have died at the Dursleys' house without anyone ever knowing what really happened to me. I was just doing my job, Pomfrey said modestly. Protecting children is supposed to be every adult's responsibility. Exactly, Harry agreed. And now it actually is, because enough adults were willing to admit that our institutions had failed and needed to be reformed. As the afternoon wore on and they reminisced about the early days of his recovery, Harry realized that this conversation with Pomfrey was bringing his remarkable journey full circle. The frightened, abused child she had treated 7 years ago had grown into a confident young adult who was about to begin advanced education in child advocacy law. The medical findings she had courageously reported had led to systematic changes that were protecting countless children throughout magical Britain. "What are you most proud of?" Pomfrey asked, as their visit drew to a close. Harry considered the question carefully. There were so many achievements he could point to: his academic success, his advocacy work, his foundation, the policy changes he had helped implement. But when he really thought about it, what made him proudest was something simpler and more fundamental. "I'm proud that I survived," he said finally. "I'm proud that I learned to value myself enough to accept help when it was offered. I'm proud that I found the courage to speak truth about what happened to me, even when it was difficult and painful. And I'm proud that I was able to transform my own suffering into something that could help other children avoid similar pain." "That's quite a legacy for an 18-year-old, Pomfrey observed with a smile. "It's just the beginning," Harry replied. "I have decades ahead of me to keep working for children who need protection and advocates who will fight for them. The foundation is established, but there's always more work to be done." As Harry prepared to leave Hogwarts that day, walking through corridors that had become synonymous with safety and growth and healing, he found himself thinking about hope. 7 years ago, hope had been a foreign concept, something that happened to other people in other circumstances. But now hope was the defining characteristic of his life and work. He had hope that the child protection systems would continue to improve and evolve. Hope that cultural attitudes toward children's rights would continue to shift toward greater protection and respect. Hope that his foundation would help hundreds or thousands of children find safety and healing. Hope that future generations of magical children would grow up in a world where their welfare was truly prioritized by the adults responsible for their care. Most personally, he had hope for his own future: advanced education that would enhance his advocacy skills, meaningful relationships based on mutual respect and affection, and the continued privilege of transforming his own experiences into tools for helping others. As he apparated from Hogsmeade to his new flat in London, Harry Potter McGonagall carried with him the unshakable conviction that healing was possible, that change was achievable, and that even the most painful experiences could be transformed into sources of strength and compassion. The boy who had once lived in a cupboard under the stairs had grown into a young man who was dedicated to ensuring that no child would ever again have to suffer in silence and isolation. It was a remarkable transformation, and it was only the beginning of what promised to be a life dedicated to justice, healing, and hope. The future was bright with possibility, and Harry intended to spend every day of it working to protect the children who would build that future themselves.